Hi everybody, you're all very welcome to Trasna na Tíre this evening on a very damp Monday evening here in Kilkenny. Tonight we're joined by Brendán or Conchúir from Tipperary, who's going to tell us a fascinating story about the Templemore apparitions, which happened in August 1920 and was very important in terms of the history of the War of Independence in Tipperary. I knew nothing about this until Brendán contacted me a couple of weeks ago, so I'm not going to do much of an introduction. I'm just going to hand you right over to Brendán. So Brendán, over to you.
Hi, thanks Liam, and thanks everyone for tuning in. So the Templemore apparitions was a period of Marian apparitions and bleeding statues in the town of Templemore that started in August 1920 in the middle of the War of Independence. I suppose in Tipperary, it's kind of the national history of the War of Independence. When it comes to Tipperary, people think of Salahead Beg and maybe the barracks raids in places like Holliford and Rossmore, and it's very much a militaristic story, and that's what most people living in Tipperary would be proud of and what would be celebrated. So I suppose this is kind of an interesting insight into how civilian life kind of continued despite or even because of the chaos that was going around them, that there was such a desire to find solace in a religious movement, even if it was only briefly. It lasted for about just shy of a month in around Templemore, starting from the middle of August, and it kind of more or less ended then, say, by about the second week in September, that in the words of the IRA volunteers in Templemore, normality had returned to the town in the space of 24 hours. So it became a massive movement, with Templemore being referred to as pilgrim in the national media. The young man who claimed to be experiencing the apparitions and who owned statues, he was referred to as a saint and could allegedly perform cures. But it became almost like a frenzy of everyone wanting to get Templemore, but then ended almost as quickly as it started. I suppose firstly, just for anyone who's not overly familiar with Tipperary, just to give you a background, Tipperary during the War of Independence and volunteer structures are split into roughly three areas. The three brigade areas. So the first Tipperary Brigade, which was north Tip, the area around Nina, and probably coming down the line there, basically from Newport above Templederry and there. That would have been the first brigade. Templemore Thurles was the second Tipperary Brigade, and the third Tipperary Brigade would have been Tipperary, Clare, Clonmel, South Tip, where the war would have started around Salahead Beg in 1919. And in the second Brigade area, in the area there in the hilly country in the east of Tipperary, so it's placed around Holy Cross, Capwide, up into Upper Church, that would have been an area that would have seen a lot of activity, particularly in early 1920, as it was more rural, and a lot of barracks were attacked there. So a lot of the things that would have been, a lot of the casualties from the War of Independence came from areas that would have been a short drive from, it would have been a very short drive to Templemore, and even then would have been definitely considered the hinterland of Thurles and Templemore. So people were very much aware of the war in Templemore. Now Templemore itself, like most towns in the county, had a strong garrison of British troops. The North Hampshire Regiment was in what's now McCann Barracks and the Garda College, but there was always at least 1,000 soldiers stationed in the town itself. So, not surprisingly, for most of 1919 and into 1920 and even beyond, there was very little in the way of IRA activity in the town itself. Most volunteers from Templemore and the surrounding villages, they would have participated, of course, in attacks on barracks across the brigade area in places like Holy Cross, Upper Church, and on attacks on RIC patrols heading out the roads that direction as well. But in the town itself, it was quite enough, not surprising given the strong garrison of both the army and the RIC. According to Sean Scott, who would have been commandant of the Templemore Battalion for the IRA in Templemore in 1919, even after the war had officially started in Salahead Bay, and Danbury and Sean Tracy wanted to run around Tipperary and would have stayed in Templemore at one point. But for the IRA in Templemore, 1919 was kind of a time of organising, training, and doing as much training as possible among the various units in areas in the area, and aside from the brief period where two of the big four for Solid Beg, Seamus Robson and Sean Tracy, were in Templemore and stayed in the family of an IRA volunteer called Leahy in the main street of Templemore, there was very little what you would call active war involved, I suppose. There was a period of arming and training and of course still recruitment, because as I'm sure a lot of you know, that the initial start of the militia campaign wasn't universally popular. It wasn't a period of flying columns yet where the IRA could patrol openly. It was very much nighttime operations, and you had to be careful of who saw you as a volunteer and who knew what you were doing. Even it's noted in one of the volunteers that on the first armistice day in Templemore, he'd gone in to do reconnaissance on the RIC barracks, but judged that the crowd in the town was so prevalent, and the mood among was so prevalently pro British Army, because there was a lot of demob soldiers, of course, with the barracks, and there would have been a lot of soldier families in the town, that it wasn't a safe place for a lone IRA volunteer to be that night. So he didn't spend the night in the town as he had planned, and went back out to Borrisoleigh. Of course, throughout 1920, as in the rest of the country, the war kind of took off. It really started, I suppose, just looking at some of the events close to Templemore in March 1920, you would have had a lot of activity starting in what would be called the hilly countryside. It's kind of an area of low mountains there that basically start at the top of the first grade area and come into second grade area. So Holliford up into Upper Church, Brendán, a lot of that kind of area. It's very, very rural and would have had a very active IRA presence at the time. But you saw it then in March 1920, two IRA volunteers in the 2nd Battalion area, Thomas Dwyer in the Rag. Thomas Dwyer in the Rag, he was killed in March 1920, and in the same day, another volunteer in Thurles town named Billy McCarthy was also murdered. They would have been killed in nighttime attacks by the RIC by a group of RIC and Black Lieutenants who can't be referred to in the area as a murder gang, because it became a pattern of their activity as they attacked volunteers in their homes as reprisals for earlier raids and ambushes. Dwyer was killed in response to an attack near where he lived in the Rag a few days previously that he himself had not taken part in, but he was a known volunteer, so he was killed for. And then in June, in a volunteer called Thomas Brett, who continually we would have celebrated, we would have marked it just there a few months ago. He was killed in action in Brendán, again, an ambush on an RIC patrol. And Brendán might be closer to Thurles, so it would be still maybe 10, 20 miles more. So it was in the same area, people kind of knew what was happening. And then across May and June, of course, we had the barracks raids in Holliford and up and across the county, which were overseen by Ernie O'Malley and involved large numbers of men from the 1st and 2nd Brigades. And then getting closer to the actual start of August, you had Michael Small, who was captain of the IRA in Borrisoleigh. He was killed in an abortive attempt to attack a barracks at a place called Chevery outside Upper Church. Now the attack was called off because a military ration truck that wasn't expected to call to State Barracks tonight stayed, and the IRA commander at the time of the attack, Edward McGrath, judged it unwise to carry out an attack. So Michael Small, realizing this, approached his commander and asked could he take leave, as he'd arranged to go to communion that day and had to tend to his cattle. But as he crossed the field, he was spotted by the truck as it moved off, and the RIC officer in command at the time of the troops ordered them to fire on him. And it was his death and the subsequent inquest that really kind of is the immediate background to the start of the apparitions. His body was taken to Templemore RIC barracks, where an inquest was held, and IRA men would have attended that inquest, and it came out in the inquest that the RIC commander, District Director Wilson, who was in charge that day, that he was held as responsible for ordering them to shoot, and by all accounts, an additional shot into the body at close range after a small had been wounded, which was fatal. So there's a lot of strongly held hatred towards him by our IRA men, and he had been a marked man before this, as he was, from an intelligence point of view, D.I. Wilson had been the officer in the town of Templemore since the early 1900s, so he was intimately familiar with the volunteers and their families. You could pick them out of crowds. It made it very easy for people to get arrested and detained, and it was just a real hindrance to their organising ability, to their operational and organising abilities in the town. So he was a marked man from as early as 1918, but for various reasons, the attack didn't come off. But on the night of August 15th, an IRA company consisting of Patrick Canaan of Upper Church, Jim Leahy of Templemore, and Jim Stapleton, who would be a great OC, drove to Templemore with John Fahy, another volunteer, to finally they were seen to carry out the execution of D.I. Wilson. Again, because he was seen as having organised a shooting of small and other volunteers. Jim Leahy in his bureau statement outlines that he had been a marked man before this, and there had been a number of failed attempts to execute Wilson outside of Templemore, but the RC man, he travelled well protected when he went out. Likely because a year previously, another district inspector, D.I. Hunt, had been shot by the IRA in Turlestown. So not surprisingly, he probably knew himself he was a marked man, especially after the events quite close by that he'd been involved in. So he was taking what would have been reasonable precautions, but obviously that meant that the IRA felt they couldn't attack him. But a few times they'd wait in ambush, and he travelled in military corners that were far too strong for the IRA to hope of pulling off a successful ambush on. So basically, when they decided that it would have to be Templemore town, and now again, as I said, this would have been a big risk because it was a strong barrack town with a strong RIC garrison as well, and probably not a hotbed of republicanism either. So they were taking big risks. There was a reason that there hadn't been much activity in the town itself. If you look at the people who commanded the area, like Edward McGrath, was from Killa. It's a village outside Templemore, but he would have been one of the leading IRA figures in the area of Templemore, but only Leahy would have been from Templemore town. Most of the leading area men would have been from outside the town itself. So basically what they did is they came into the town, went to the house of a volunteer, where they waited for the daytime on the street. They had spotters, and they saw Wilson coming out of his house, and they was coming up the street. Jim Stapleton, who would have been involved in the ambush on D.I. Hunt, and would have fired some shots at Hunt. Now, not known if he fired fatal shots, because there was a few others who were saying that as well. But he'd been involved in the attack on D.I. Hunt in Thurles the year previously. He had crossed the road to a public house called over by a friend. So he was stood in the door of a public house talking to a friend of his while keeping an eye on the street. Wilson walked past the ambush party on Patrick, who's just at the top of Main Street there in Templemore. Stapleton looked at him. Now, he would have passed right by him on the footpath outside the pub. Shared a stern look. Stapleton, according to the account of Patrick Canaan, Big Jim, who he's the second from, as I'm looking at it, he's the second from the man in the grey coat and tobacco standing there. He stepped out behind him, put a pistol to the base of Wilson's head, and executed him. There was only one shot fired in the attack. And according to Canaan and other volunteers who were involved in the attack, that Wilson was dead before he hit the ground. Not surprisingly, the ambush party quickly fled through the men's grounds in Templemore to a prearranged exit route that they had planned to the townlands at this foot of Devil's Bit in a place called Brendán, where they rested on the mountain for a while. And now, according to Canaan, from Patrick Canaan, his statement, as they rested, they could see the flames start as the British Army, in retaliation, began to attack shops and began to attack certain shops and burnt the town hall in Templemore. So now, they didn't destroy the entire town, but they set about burning down the town hall and they would have destroyed Kelly's house, which would have been the home that the ambush party had waited in. Kelly, they would have been a Republican family in the town. The brothers of the family would have been volunteers, and so it was known that's where that they had been involved in the ambush in some way. So they were targeted. A few other shops had their windows broken, and so now and a number of creameries as well outside. So while the main body of troops that came out of the barracks, they attacked the town, smaller parties headed out to Lockmore to the south, Killa to the north, and Castleiney to the southeast of the town. They would have headed out and they attacked and burnt the creameries there. And interestingly enough, now there was actually no civilian or IRA fatalities. Now the IRA, according to some, there was a plan to come back into the town, but I don't think that was really the IRA. Like they carried out what they intended to do, and they weren't looking to try and put up a fight to a large body of British troops. So the only two actual fatalities in the fire were two British soldiers, Captain Betty and Lance Corporal Fuggle, who they apparently was Captain Betty. And Betty, he was setting the fire in the town hall and got some flammable material on himself, or got trapped in the flames somehow. And Fuggle, in attempting to save him from the flames, was also killed. Fuggle was interesting in that he was actually, I know it was the North Hampshire Regiment, but Fuggle would actually have been from a prominent enough Dublin Unionist family. So his death was kind of significant to like Irish lives, in that he was actually an Irish British soldier who died in, and both his and Wilson's funerals would have been marked by what was official Ireland at the time, quite significantly. Wilson would have been described as a gallant policeman who could have retired but stayed on to answer his country's hour of need, because he didn't retire before the start of the War of Independence, even though he was well over retirement age. Now, I mean, from a Republican perspective, that would be seen as, he made a conscious choice to aid the enemy, but from the point of view of the RC and the British establishment, he was gallantly doing his job and was murdered for it. Now, this is kind of where the story of the apparition starts, because I know I've only really talked to you some of the background there of kind of what the IRA was doing in Tipperary, and specifically what volunteers who would have been from Templemore from the area would have been involved in, and why Wilson would have been targeted, and why the war this would have been the first actual act of war by the IRA in Templemore town. So it was but in response to it, basically the day after the attack, the date's wrong there just on that side. I don't know, I won't put a picture of the internet. It says the 18th, but he would have been killed on the 16th of August. The day after, it was on the 16th when they set fire to it. So it was that evening, later on that day, a young boy from a place called Curraheen out by Gortagary, about 5 miles west of the town. 5 miles west of Templemore, he brought in statues that he owned, that he claimed had started to bleed from their eyes into the town of Templemore. And he also claimed that he'd been experiencing Marian apparitions, and that a holy well had appeared in his bedroom in Curraheen. And a number of other bleeding statues are reported there. Instantly, there was actually one in the RIC barracks that Walsh had given to a policeman a few weeks previously. So there's a connection there that's kind of relevant to it. But that actually caused a furor, because the RIC commander, when a crowd of pilgrims first showed up, the pilgrims forced their way into the RIC barracks to see the statue. So after that, the statue, along with the others, was put in a makeshift altar across the road from what was called Dawn's newsagent's time. It's still a newsagent now. It's on the north side of the square, and more there's a little archway there, 2 doors up from the guard station, and that's where they built a little makeshift altar, and people came to see the statues and Jimmy Walsh. That's a picture of Jimmy Walsh from 1920. He would have been 16 at the time. He was born in the Rag, but at the time he was living in Curraheen, as he was working on a farm of Matters, who were in-laws of Dawn's, in whose shop the altar was set up. And that's the altar in Dawn's yard there, and that's Dawn's children praying at the altar. Yeah. Now, the belief that kind of spread through the town story was that divine intervention had saved the town from destruction, because as I said, despite the soldiers having said they were going to get back at the people of Templemore and the Catholic Irish for the murder of an Irish police officer, there was no fatalities, and there wasn't, broadly speaking, there wasn't widespread destruction. They destroyed a small number of buildings and a few, but most people's houses escaped unscathed. So there was a belief that divine intervention had saved town, and that spread when Walsh brought in the statues. Apparently, some notable people started praying that the good people of the decent people of Templemore hadn't suffered unduly the night before. And so as news spread, then of course, as you can imagine, the news of both the murder of Wilson and of the apparitions started to spread rapidly. It was covered in local and national and eventually even international media. Well, the apparitions were covered in international media anyway, and so almost immediately, not only did you see coverage of it, you saw advertisements of souvenirs, and there was a daily coach put on from Dublin that left what is now outside what's now Euston Station, and a coach tour from Dublin to Templemore during 1920, or passing through what was effectively a country at war, and also there was no motorways went again, so it was a long trip. People were sleeping overnight when they got to Templemore because all the guest houses were full. It was a real boom to the economy of the area, as well as everything else. But basically, when people started coming, then and the town became known as Pilgrimville or Pilgrim Town, and James Walsh or Jimmy Walsh, he began to refer to the media as Saint Jimmy, and it was said that he could perform cures by placing a statue on you, or by drinking water from the holy well that had appeared out in the cottage in Curraheen where he was living. So people would come to Templemore, and then you would see the statue, and then you would head on to Curraheen, which would be, as you head basically towards past the Devil's Bit, again it's called the Mountain Road, and you're heading basically, it's the hill between Templemore and Barsley. It's kind of up the side of the hill there. He was living in a cottage there, and so we had a lot of you had thousands of people making a daily trip out small rural mountain roads. And it was such was the demand that there was extra trains put on from Dublin, Limerick, basically everywhere in the country to bring people in. Like people who were visiting Ireland from, like, there's stories of American priests and others visiting Templemore to see the statue. Despite this, there was kind of obviously a bit of an industry, because there was people making money off running the coach tours. There were people selling souvenirs. There was also people were taking souvenirs themselves, so they were like taking up bits of gravel from the sites where the statues were held, or similar, or basically anything you get their hands on as a souvenir. And despite the excitement and the fervour of ordinary Catholics, and indeed even some of the clergy, the hierarchy, unsurprisingly, were hesitant enough. Reverend Kiley, who would be the parish priest in Templemore, he, for the entire 3 weeks to a month period, refused to visit statues. He kind of deemed it a hoax early on. Now, I don't think he ever outrightly condemned people visiting them, but he wouldn't have associated himself with it in any way. And the Bishop of Limerick kind of urged people to use kind of their sense and rationality in viewing events. And what other members of the clergy would have been in choose. I think there was, I've seen some in an article I know that was kind of, you could see a bit of an age where younger priests and curates are kind of more enthused by it than, say, bishops or senior priests and deacons. They were kind of like, look, there's something a bit not right here. But some of these clergy would have arranged in for Walsh and his statues to visit other towns. So he would have gone to this Mount Mellery there in south on the Waterford border, to the seminary there to visit chapel, and he also went to Cashel. And in Cashel, it was also reported that he touched the crucifix in the presbytery, and that began to bleed. And while he was staying in Cashel, word got round, and a crowd of pilgrims assembled in Cashel to visit it as well. So it kind of followed him wherever he went, and he became, I won't want to say celebrity because it was kind of a religious thing, but effectively, like, he had his 15 minutes of fame and almost had a kind of following. He was, in the eyes of many people, a saint. He could work miracles. The stories of of a soldier who was suffering shrapnel wounds from fighting in France from World War One, and who couldn't be cured. He's been 2 years in military hospital. He came out from Limerick to statues and was touched by a statue. Was touched by Welshman statues, and he was cured. There was piles of crutches discarded at the cottage from the wells, so people were. So they seem to be genuinely curing people. It's kind of, and that could be a placebo effect, whatever. But people deeply, deeply believe that they were being cured, and you take either by being touched by the statues, or by being Welsh himself, or by even in some cases people taking away bottles of water from the holy well to drink or to bless their families with. Or I suppose similar to what people would do at holy sites like Knock and Maggiore still, but a real belief that there was a miracle and that you were going to be cured. So this is kind of where it gets kind of an interesting aspect of the story. Is that picture there is those are 4 IRA volunteers from the local area who the IRA basically had to step in and provided very mundane civilian duties, considering that a few weeks previously there had been fatal attacks on Crown forces by the IRA in the area. They now found themselves providing crowd control and traffic control for pilgrims. It was kind of interesting in that the British Army just stayed in their barracks. They didn't come up to do that. The RIC, aside from the time when they had to forcefully expel a crowd of pilgrims from the RIC barracks and then put the statue across the yard in that archway there, which is Dawn's Yard, which, as I said, you can still see. There's only a gateway there now. You can still see it if you're in Templemore. The RIC kind of were happy to stay behind doors. I don't know whether were they kind of worried about the national sentiment of the crowd, or was it just that they were overwhelmed and didn't have the manpower? They're happy that the IRA step in and try crowd control. So it's interesting because you had some guys like Big Jim Taylor and stuff who, were IRA gunmen. He shot 2 senior district inspectors. He now found himself collecting tolls for driving on the mountain road and giving people effectively parking tickets. And now the reason you had to do this is it's hard to imagine. Templemore today is a town of 2,000 people. At the height of the pyramid, there was up to 15,000 people a day coming to the town. So people were sleeping in the square because they had nowhere else to stay. Every guest house, every hotel, every even spare room was kind of full. So people, and another thing the IRA did, which I suppose probably would have, again, it kind of shows the class characteristics of Republican movement, in that you definitely wouldn't have had the RIC coming out and doing it, but they strictly enforced price controls in the town, because as the pilgrims showed up, unsurprisingly, prices went up. The price of a room, the price of a meal, the price of a drink, all went up. So the IRA established a list of what they called fair prices, and they went around to ensure that they were being charged and were fairly stern in ensuring that was the way it was done. There was no real incidents of them having to do anything too severe. The threat of what they might do was enough kind of to get businesses to comply, and that seems to have been appreciated by the pilgrims who with reporting in some of the foreign press, they spoke of the exemplary treatment they received by the young men of Oakley and Heron, who were providing the civilian policing duties at the duration of the operations. So I suppose while this kind of created a burden then for the IRA, Leahy, who would have been the commander, he kind of bemoaned it initially because he was like, it's creating extra burdens and all this distraction from the war. It was kind of a de facto truce. I don't think it was ever no kind of agreement between the RIC and the IRA for a truce during the period, but it was kind of more there was just too many civilians around, and the IRA were just too distracted with actually taking over managing the town to have carried off any operation. So since though the British authorities, well, the RIC the County Inspector Dunlop, he also even welcomed the positive effect in the area, because he noted that I suppose it was from a war zone basically to a religious site, so there was a real change. There was a real change for the RIC point of view, and that while it was still a bit pandemonium, there was no real danger to the life of any RIC man in the Templemore town area for the duration of the apparitions. Edward McGrath, who would have been over the 2nd Brigade area, in his report to GHQ he said Templemore was full of pilgrims, beggars, stallholders, and undesirables. And he also bemoaned the burden placed on the local IRA, as again, as I said, the police and military left them to deal with the crowds. However, this wasn't completely just benevolent from the IRA's perspective. It definitely was a propaganda win for them because they showed Republicans could manage a town, and they also, that number of people visited, and they were having a positive experience with the IRA. As it has been said at the time, it was only a year or so after Fala Beg when even a lot of nationalist Ireland would view that as outright murder, and there wasn't no ground for support even in Tipperary immediately for the war. So this would have been significant in the kind of battle for hearts and minds. But the local IRA commander, Templemore, as an engineer, Jimmy Leahy, he resolved the issue of the burden being placed in IRA because he introduced a levy of 2 shillings 6p per day on every car that was going up to Mountain Road, because the IRA was having to fill in the road every day because it was getting worn out with the amount of traffic on it. So the IRA kind of effectively became, I said, a mixture of council worker and civilian police officer for the duration of it. And you got your little parking ticket, you got a slip of paper signed over in your hair, and when you pay your 2 shillings 6p and that covered you for a day. So it was interesting enough, the biggest opposition to that wasn't from the British authorities. It was Count O'Brien, the local Sinn Féin TD. He was outraged that the IRA would impose a levy without Dáil County Council or also you'd have to say his approval. He would have said that it was an irregular charge that they had no authority to do it. Leahy would respond to him because he demanded a meeting with Leahy, and Leahy responded that everything about the situation was irregular and they were doing what was necessary. And said that the intention of the money was to cover the expenses of the IRA and maintaining the roads and paying the men who had to give up their days to manage the crowds, and anything surplus was set aside for the quartermaster's funds for purchasing of weapons. So I mean, from the IRA's point of view, it was, as much as they were annoyed at doing it, it was a material benefit to them. They were making money off it. The IRA also, as I said, they ensured that there wasn't any profiteering, and they guarded the altar at dawn, the IRA, to stop anyone damaging it. So that had to give them. They were seen in a very positive light by the pilgrims. However, as well as this official levy, the IRA in Cummin placed collection boxes along the pilgrimage route. So it was and apparently in the collection boxes, depending on whose bureau statement you read, it was somewhere between £1,000 and £1,500 raised for the two groups over the period. So, and there was also individual tips given to IRA men by people. So I mean, there was a real kind of material benefit. And it was that issue of individual tips that actually was one of Leahy's big issues, because while the money that was in the collection boxes or paid for the tickets had to be accounted for and handed over to the quartermaster, the tips were pocketed by volunteers, and Leahy bemoaned to GHQ that otherwise upright volunteers were taken to drinking and leisure because, well, they had plenty of money and their job was a lot easier than what they had been doing a few months previously. They weren't having to collect weapons, they weren't having to prepare dumps or carry out attacks. They were just managing crowds and getting paid very well for it. However, like I said, it was kind of a de facto truth, but some people talk of truth, and I don't of it kind of being official. I don't really think there's much to back it up, because there's a few incidents in the bureau statements that kind of show that there was still a simmering away bit of conflict, bit of the conflict. That a little reminder that you weren't completely back to peacetime, that there was still a war going on outside of the 10-mile area around Templemore that had kind of gone mad at pilgrims. Thomas O'Whaling of the East Limerick Brigade and later of the East Limerick Flying Column, he was passing through Templemore with some other Limerick volunteers during the time they were coming back from Dublin, and they decided that the best way to avoid suspicion was to go to pilgrim traffic through the town of Templemore. Now they stayed in a house nearby, and it would have been a known safe house, and they narrowly avoided being caught in a raid. They had to flee. So the RSC were still raiding houses in the area looking for volunteers. Now there's no accounts of, there's no fatalities during this period, and there's no attacks on the RSC, but there were still efforts that insurgency and counterinsurgency, despite the pilgrims. So it wasn't ever a complete truce. It's just more so the sheer number of people made having an active war impossible for a group like the IRA, who was reliant on civilian support to carry off any successful operations. In another incident this is kind of what ended the apparitions. Jim Ryan of Shannakill was on the mountain road collecting the tax. So again, Jim Ryan would have been a very active IRA volunteer, and here he was just on the road collecting £2 shillings off every car to go fast. And when he was on the mountain road at the time when there was shots, there was an attack organised by the 3rd Battalion at Killochrehan, a bit out the road, Templemore, kind of between where the 3rd Brigade and the 2nd Brigade boundaries kind of overlapped. And he brought the news into Templemore just before the RIC arrived with a wounded officer. And again, that caused a number of volunteers having to flee the town, as the RIC arriving and seeing some known volunteers outside the hotel, entered the hotel with the intention of arresting him. Now, no one got arrested, but again, in fears of that was kind of what started the end of it, because there was fears of reprisals, and there would be fears of reprisals in town, and people and pilgrims kind of started to flee. Again, that's what they fled the town. Then basically that kind of is what ended it. Now, again, as I said, well, there was general hysteria about it, and it seems to be almost everyone in Ireland wanted to see the apparitions or the statues or Saint Jimmy, as they called him. There was little evidence that anyone senior in the IRA believed it. I said Jim Leahy, he met what he himself and local Irishmen had interrogated Walsh, and they deemed him to either be, in their words, suffering hallucinations or some way mentally disturbed. So they basically felt he was either mentally unwell or he was always a con job and he was making it up. And Edward McGrath had asked GHQ to intervene. GHQ had contacted Jimmy Lacey and summoned him to Dublin, where Collins arranged for Dan Green and Dennis Lacey to interrogate him in a safe house. Now, by all accounts, Green interrogated him for 15 minutes. It was a brief enough interview, during which, by all accounts, it was just an interview that Walsh was very open with what he believed. Walsh stated that the Virgin Mary had started appearing to him in July, and she had told him to go public with the apparitions in August. And he went on to say that the Virgin Mary supported the IRA's campaign, and is particularly the targeting of black and tans, and wants to see an escalation of the conflict. So again, kind of definitely not kind of keeping in what the Catholic hierarchy would be saying about the armed campaign. And so at this point, apparently, Green notes in his bureau statement that Lacey, who himself was a very devout Catholic, the stories of him, he would have prayed the rosary while on operations with the 3rd Brigade's flying column later in the war. He said to Jimmy Walsh, next time that he was talking to the Virgin Mary, to tell her that only a republic would do. And there was a bit of and so Lacey and Breen went out of the room, and Collins was apparently waiting in another room in the safe house. And they said to him that Breen's judgment was he was either a hoax or Walsh was a spy, somehow trying to, somehow disrupt war effort or get close to the area with transcript stories to get information that would be useful to the Brits. Now, Collins, there was a bit of banter. Collins apparently said, sure, it's easy to believe you, Dan, you've no religion anyway. But anyway, it was no real belief that from the area that I was taken seriously. And it must be said that Walsh had he was only young, like he was only 15. He was one of 12 children, so a big family who had all been farm labourers. His brother apparently had been arrested and had been on hunger strike in Gloucester prison for being active in the volunteer movement. But there's no mention of his brother being a volunteer during the War of Independence. That appears that after his time in Gloucester prison that he had suffered badly. He was on hunger strike, and that he wasn't well enough to be on active service again after that. But anyway, this kind of left in an issue of what to do with Jimmy, because they'd taken him out of Templemore, and they decided that he was at best making hold him up, at worst was somehow working for British intelligence. So it was what to do with him. Collins ordered that Walsh be taken away. So the arrangement would go to Pallaskinnery, where he stayed, and there was a presbytery there. He stayed with some clergy there, and apparently there, while he was Canon Ryan and other priests who had also been contacted by the IRA, got him to admit that he had faked faked the apparitions that they find. And apparently then Walsh, he decided that was the best thing for him to do was to leave for England, because he admitted the thing with the fake, and he was also marked as a spy for the IRA, but at the same time, he was still seen as a saint in the popular imagination, so the pilgrims probably would have still kept coming if he had been there. And Sean Scott, the commandant of Templemore, in his bureau statement, he knows that that's kind of what was the end of it. After a few weeks, a mixture of the skepticism of the Catholic hierarchy and the ambush I already mentioned at Killisheehan, which a few miles from Templemore, that would have been on one of the pilgrim routes, and there's some evidence that the IRA, they chose that point as an ambush to kind of make that road too unsafe and too unappealing to pilgrims to travel on, to try and stem the flow. But that sharply hastened the route, because the ambush took place and a wounded, if not dead, RIC man was taken into the town of Templemore. And there was real fear of reprisals, and indeed more reprisals did come eventually, and including attacks on the shrine, in that they went both in Templemore, both in Templemore town and out of Curraheen, where crutches that had been discarded by people who had been cured. So I don't know, the people had claimed to be cured, and they discarded their crutches out at the cottage. There was a collection of crutches out there. They kind of went in, they smashed up the cottage, they broke up some of the crutches, and that kind of went in. It was kind of noted that the stall holders, the beggars, and the pilgrims, they all fled, and within 24 hours, normality kind of reigned in the town again. And after this, I suppose, kind of the only kind of postscript in Collins ordered that a statue be brought up, to him in GHQ. Collins, the story goes, he smashed the statue off the table, kind of to show that what he had mocked Dan Green for having no religion. He wasn't too devout, that he wasn't overly devout about himself. He had no fear of cracking open a statue of the Virgin Mary, but he found the mechanism of a clock inside with a pack of sheep's blood, and basically when it struck a certain time, it pushed the blood out through the eyes of the statue to make it look like they were. Because bear in mind, all the statues that were bleeding, they were either statues in Jimmy Walsh's possession or statues he had given to someone else. And Walsh now himself, he went to England late 19. So in September he would have went to England. By 1923 he was in Australia, and again there's speculation that might have been out of his fear of having been branded a spy. But it's also likely that it was a massive waste of time as well. But he never returned to Ireland, and there's a bit of a post there in Australia. He got a job as a lay teacher in a Catholic school. But years later, he was recognised by an immigrant from Ireland as St. Jimmy. And when the story was said to his Catholic superiors in Australia, he was kind of deemed unsuitable to be a teacher, because he made up such a cock and bull story about holy statues, and he lost that job, and then when he found other work, he ended his days working as a porter in a hospital. And he's buried in Australia, and his family have been back to Ireland. I've heard, and they've been taken to the cottage where the apparitions happened, and they see it as kind of an instant to their family history. But yeah, that was and then for Templemore itself, in October 1920, there was another ambush on an RIC patrol, and the town would have been sacked a second time. An off-licensed store was emptied of its drink and then burnt out by the RIC and Black and Tans. And that's kind of the only really other significant event in Templemore itself up until the time of the truce. There were being attacks in and around the area, but the town itself, again, barrack town, similar to say Thurles, Cahir, and even Tipperary town. The ambushes didn't really take place in the town, so that was kind of it. At the time of the truce, then the barracks became McCann Barracks, named after the first Sinn Féin MP for the area, Pierce McCann, who died in 1918 in prison. And yeah, so I suppose that's really the story. It's fascinating kind of snippet of local history.
That's great, Brendán. I've a couple of little questions for you here, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
the first one really is a personal one for me, and I've only kind of read the story over the last couple of weeks since you contacted me. But the question I'd have is around the whole story about the clock mechanism and the sheep's blood, and that being discovered by Michael Collins. Like, what's your own thoughts on if there were multiple statues in Templemore at that time exhibiting those characteristics? How come it was just Michael Collins who discovered it? Because in the 1920s, clock mechanisms and sheep's blood and all that would have been a highly technical operation, I suppose, to have across multiple statues.
Yeah, I suppose it's not really expanded on that. It's noted in one of the biographies of Collins that's how it was discovered. But and John Reynolds kind of in his book that he would have been the historian who's done the most work on the story. He kind of gives the credit instead. It was a fairly rudimentary mechanism, but basically it was when the clocks, instead of having where we're struck and it would have rang the bells that it struck and kind of puncture that the hammer was still there, and instead of whacking metal, it whacked blood bag, and it popped, and that was enough to bring them out. But it's just, I know it is a strange one because the people who were cured genuinely felt they were cured, but there is something very special about it because the altar was immediately set up in Dawn's yard. Jimmy Walsh was living in a cottage owned by and working for a sister-in-law of Dawn's. The other statue that was in his possession had been given to people by him. So there was kind of all the statues were connected to him. So it's a strange one in whatever way they did it, but it's hard to believe it with any sort of credibility to it.
It is. Thanks, Brendán. That's a great answer. I have another one coming in here from Dan Jack up in Clonard in Belfast.
How are you, Dan?
So Seamus Robinson, in his witness statement, mentions that Dan Breen brought Walsh to one of their safe houses in Dublin, 71 Haybursey Street, which was raided a short time afterwards, thus implying he was a spy. Would you have a view on whether he was a spy or not?
It's really hard. It's really hard to say. That seems to be the takeaway from it, that he was, and that it might have been a bit of a kind of a honeypot exercise to draw the IRA into the open down to more, because they had to come out and very, very publicly. Now, they didn't come out and front, but they were the authority, and it was clear who was volunteers. And as I said, he had no pleasure for publicanism himself, and he seemed to be egging the IRA to take more risk. That he was saying that the Virgin Mary wants him to do what would be more high risk operations. So there might be some credence to it, but again, I'm hard to see if it was a case of espionage. It's a bit like the CIA's exploding cigars for Castro. Kind of, it's out there and its effectiveness as to how useful it would be.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I have another one from Angela there, just saying fascinating stuff. Well done. Can you remind us how long this period went on for?
Right. Yes.
The wellspring up.
A town called Corraheen. I don't even know Tipperary. So basically, it's on the road. If you turn off Killatoma, across Killatoma to the Protestant church, heading towards a place called Gortagary, and I don't have the picture on the slides, and because you can see of the cottage. It's the cottage is a farm shed now, but you can still see the cottage if you're in the area. It's on a road about 6 miles. It's a back road kind of on the just before Gortagary, and kind of straight south of Gortagary, heading back down towards the main road for Templemore, place called Corraheen. And it went on. Now, Walsh claimed the operation when he was interrogated. He claimed the Virgin Mary started appearing to him in July, but he came in the day after Wilson was shot. And the claim was that the Virgin Mary had saved the town from further destruction. And it went on basically then till the period of 3 weeks, solid 3 weeks, a little bit into the 4 week, but that ambushed in at the end of the first week of September 1920, and the fair reprisals after it. really kind of clear people out of town, because I mean it's an incident in a way that reprisals kind of started it and reprisals kind of ended it, because I say you see the words Ed McGrath there, the pilgrims, tramps, stallholders, they made a hasty exit, and basically within a day the town was back to normal. But that would have been, there's no set, trying to remember the date, the ambush, it would have been early September, I think it was September 5th or 6th. It was, went on for 3 weeks, 3 weeks maximum roughly.
That's great, Brendán. And listen, thank you very much. You've answered all of those questions very comprehensively. Just realised there I'm not on video. Listen, thanks a million for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
I must admit, that was an aspect of our national history I hadn't the bogs about prior to this evening. So it's great being informed that. I was actually brought by my parents down to Ballinspittle when I was about 9 or 10 years of age, so it kind of rings a bit of a bell for me personally. I found that absolutely fascinating, and the impact it had on our national history. So thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll have you back for another one of Tipperary's War of Independence history again soon. Thanks so much, Brendán.
Well, thank you.